Sometimes, a lengthy run on top is the best way to make an impact in the wrestling industry. After all, it worked for the likes of John Cena, Hulk Hogan, and Bruno Sammartino. That said, this doesn't always have to be the case. No, on occasion a performer can be more memorable for only briefly standing in the spotlight, letting their star shine, and then getting out before they're no longer welcome. And sometimes, this can all be achieved within a single year. But what are the most notable examples of this in wrestling history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. So join us as we take a deep dive into one and done wrestling's one-year runs. And as always, if we're going to start anywhere, why not do so with one of the most notable examples of this phenomenon, and that's the time Goldberg made his WWE debut in 2003. Yes, younger fans might be more familiar with the Tulsa native's more recent runs in New York, where he's largely been booked like an absolutely unkillable monster, but these didn't represent the first time he had a go-around under Vince McMahon's sports entertainment banner. No, after the fall of WCW in 2001, Bill actually made his first appearance in WWE at the tail end of the Attitude Era. How would this go for him? Well, with mixed results if we're being honest, because after debuting the night after WrestleMania 19, cheating fans out of the dream match between him and Stone Cold Steve Austin in the process, the former WCW World Champion entered straight into a feud with The Rock. And while this feud was good, and it gave Bill an early win to establish himself with, following on from there, things began to falter, as feeling like they needed to put their own stamp on him, WWE decided to change up the winning Goldberg formula. Of course, this meant rather than have him destroy everyone in his path in short bouts, the new signing instead had to work comedy segments and longer matches, something which didn't play into his explosive character. So by the time the summer came and he hit a Reign of Terror Triple H-shaped wall, much of Bill's luster had already dissipated. Sure, he would win the World Heavyweight title, but even that wasn't enough to make him feel as special as he should have been. And this all led to frustration on his part, as he eventually decided he wouldn't be renewing his one-year contract once it ran out after WrestleMania 20. That's right, after a disastrous bout with Brock Lesnar at the Showcase of the Immortals in 2004, the man who was once arguably the biggest star in the industry left wrestling behind entirely. Thankfully though, when he came back again in 2016, WWE would have at least figured out how to use him correctly this time. But that wasn't the only person they were using to the fullest effect as the 2010s began drawing to a close, because just 2 years later in 2018, Ronda Rousey's first run in New York would see her smash all expectations. Now, you could argue in hindsight that it should have been obvious the baddest woman on the planet would be a success in the squared circle. After all, she'd been a fan of the industry ever since she was a kid, and with her legitimate fighting skills, she has an aura to her that makes her feel like the Brock Lesnar of any women's division she's in. Still though, at the time, it wasn't considered obvious she'd be a hit, as with her never actually having trained as a wrestler before, there was some doubt as to how well Rousey would take to the whole thing. But any doubts people had would ultimately be laid to rest during her debut at WrestleMania 38, as there, in a mixed tag team bout pitting her and Kurt Angle against Triple H and Stephanie McMahon, Ronda absolutely stole the show. That's right, if anyone wasn't a believer in her before this, they certainly were after, and her momentum only continued to grow from there as the months went on, and she proved to be something of a prodigy. Sure, the booking team had to jump through a few hoops to make it feel in any way realistic that the likes of Alexa Bliss and Natalya would stand any kind of chance against her in a fight. But with some mental gymnastics, it kinda made sense after a while. And once Becky Lynch's new The Man character entered the equation, it only took Ronda to another level altogether. Why was this? Well, now, with a generational rival to go up against, Ronda was suddenly able to elevate the women's division to a level it had never been before, namely, the main event of WrestleMania. Yeah, by the time the bout came, Charlotte Flair would also be forced in there, watering the whole thing down somewhat, but this doesn't change the fact that because of her mainstream star power and ability to quickly take to the ring, women's wrestling in North America was bigger than it had ever been because of the former UFC bantamweight champion. Of course, since then, her second run has not been met with the same levels of success, and for some baffling reason, we've still yet to see that Rousey-Lynch singles match. But that doesn't take away from anything Ronda did prior. Hell, you could argue that to this day, her original run was the most successful one-year spell of all time, though others might still argue for the time The Rock went Hollywood instead. But wait, what was this one? Well, after spending a period as the hero of the people during the Attitude Era, Dwayne Johnson slowly found himself being stretched in two different directions once his movie career began picking up steam in the early 2000s. That said, while having multiple irons in the fire was certainly a good thing for him, it wasn't such a good thing for wrestling fans, as they began to feel like they were losing the Great One to a more mainstream industry. Needless to say then, this bred resentment after a while as, seeing less and less of their guy, they began to boo him whenever he did show up. How would The Rock deal with these reactions? By playing up to them fully and turning heel, of course. But this wasn't any normal heel turn. No, this was arguably the greatest run of his entire career, as now embracing the role of movie star, Dwayne Johnson morphed into an arrogant Hollywood figure in front of people's eyes. Yes, whether it was berating fans, playing special rock concerts in the ring, or just generally acting like the biggest douchebag in the world, the 10-time world champion was firing on all cylinders here. And this reflected itself in his actual matches as well, because between January of 2003 and April of 2004, he not only had a great feud against the aforementioned Bill Goldberg, but he also slayed a couple of dragons when he pinned Hulk Hogan for a second time at No Way Out during the former year, then finally beat Steve Austin at WrestleMania 19 during the latter. But that wasn't all he was doing, because the Great One was also taking time to give back to those lower on the card by having an excellent TV program with the Hurricane, proving he was just as selfless as ever. It's just a shame that our next subject couldn't find the same levels of success during their one-year run in New York then, because back in 1997, the Patriot just wasn't able to make it out of first gear. Sure, this wasn't entirely his fault, as by that time, Dell Wilkes was so ravaged with injuries he was a shadow of the man he'd previously been while working for the likes of All Japan Pro Wrestling. But why was he signed to WWF in the first place? Well, it was right in the middle of the Canada versus America angle, which spanned most of that year. And with Bret Hart being the WWF champion come the autumn, it meant a new US-based main eventer would have to be brought in to challenge him, as he'd already beaten everyone else. Enter the Patriot then, a man wearing a Star-Spangled Banner mask who immediately set about taking on the Hitman and winning the title back for his home country. The only problem was that, with his work being limited by now, and the majority of WWF fans at the time generally having no idea of Dell Wilkes' history, he just wasn't able to get over quickly enough. And so when he did challenge for the top prize, it felt less like a big-time main event, and more like a random mid-carder had stumbled into the spot instead. Obviously then, all this led to him being phased back down the card pretty quickly, as by November, he'd be reduced to losing to the likes of Jim Neidhart on Shotgun Saturday Night. And not long after that, he'd be gone altogether when a tricep injury forced him to retire. Could Dell Wilkes have been more in WWF? Maybe, if such a run had come at a different point in his career. But having a late career run isn't always a negative. No, sometimes it can allow someone to use all their experience to shine even greater, as was the case when William Regal went to AEW in 2022. Of course, by this point, Regal's time in the ring had long since come to an end, and so the role he filled here was more of a managerial one. That's right, this was the birth of the Blackpool Combat Club, one of the best stables in the industry today. But that didn't make things any less impactful, because the people he'd end up managing after first showing up at that year's Revolution pay-per-view would be none other than Jon Moxley and Bryan Danielson. And part of the reason it's so great is because, when it was first getting established, each member, whether it be Moxley, Danielson, or later Wheeler Yuta and Claudio Castagnoli, took all their cues from the Staffordshire native. So this meant crisp, European-style mat work and a strong sense of psychology to every bout they took part in, something which quickly got fans engaged. And while the BCC were taking care of business in the ring, Regal was often found to be bringing some levity to the proceeding over on the commentary booth, where he would playfully flirt with Excalibur or jawjack with the likes of Tony Schiavone, Jim Ross, and Taz. That said, like all good things, this run had to come to an end eventually, and that happened a year later when the Englishman requested to be released from his contract so he could return to WWE and help train his son, Charlie Dempsey. And while such a move may have been the right thing for him in the long run, it has left something of a hole in AEW, even if the Blackpool Combat Club continue to fight on in his absence. But one person who certainly didn't leave a hole when his time in the spotlight ended was our next subject, and that's because despite being given a mega push right out of the gate, today, Giant Gonzalez is mostly remembered for being one of the least beloved big men WWF has ever seen. Seriously, even by the standards of Undertaker opponents in the early 90s, George Gonzalez still manages to stand out. But then it's hard for him not to, as being billed as 8 feet tall in height, he's legitimately the tallest wrestler in WWE history. That said, while this did help make a huge presence once he debuted at the 1993 Royal Rumble, it only ended up hindering him in the long run, because being so big meant he could barely perform any kind of basic move. And as if that wasn't bad enough, there was also the truly questionable ring gear he had to work. So, with all these factors combined then, he had certainly lost some momentum by the time he officially faced off against the Phenom at WrestleMania 9. That's right, Taker versus Gonzalez at WrestleMania 9, easily the worst of all the streak matches. And that's largely because of the ending, which saw the heel get himself disqualified when he choked his opponent out with a chloroform-soaked rag. So with the failure of this one, Vince McMahon decided to cut his losses, and after one more return bout between the pair at SummerSlam, he swiftly pushed Gonzalez back down the card to the point where, by the time Autumn came around, he was being set up to feud with Adam Bomb. In the end though, even this program never really got started because, lacking confidence in the big man's abilities, the boss ultimately chose not to renew his contract and instead let Giant Gonzalez go over to Japan for a while, where he'd have finished out his career altogether come 1995. Yes, it's sad that such a potentially big star couldn't have clicked more with both fans and management, but then some things just aren't meant to be. Luckily for WWF though, they would already have another great one-year-long run cooking by this point, as elsewhere on the card, Doink the Clown was going strong. And we know Doink lasted more than a year as a character, but the specific version we're talking about here is the original played by Matt Osborne, an incarnation which was treated more as a psychotic Heath Ledger-esque heel than anything else. Sure, other versions of the clown would also find success as a lovable, goofy babyface, but let's be honest, the whole thing was never better than it was right at the start. Why was this? Well, no one else understood the potential of the character better than Osborne did, as he was able to imbue it with such a sense of creepiness and dread, it quickly exceeded any expectations people within the company had for it. Seriously, if you go back and look at those early days of Doink, you'll see what should have been a ridiculous 90s gimmick actually come across as something genuinely scary at times, enough to where many of the kids in the audience were terrified of him. It didn't matter if he was going up against Crush, Bret Hart, or Tatanka. The evil clown always went the extra mile to make himself seem like a truly despicable villain. And that helped to keep him in a regular spot on the card then, as other out there characters faltered far quicker. Unfortunately though, such a great run would end up coming to a close before its time, as due to a combination of Vince McMahon's desire to turn Doink babyface and Matt Osborne's notorious backstage issues, the North Carolinian would be fired from the company in 1993 and replaced under the face paint by Steve Keirn instead. And while this did see the clown continue on for a while yet, much of what made it special would be gone at this point, as now playing more of a fan favorite hero, it just never felt as cool as it had before. But then this was also because the original Doink wasn't there anymore either, and the spark of what had set it all off just couldn't be replicated by anyone else. It would be like someone other than Mark Calloway trying to play The Undertaker, or a different person being under the Kane mask. No, you could argue the whole thing should have been retired at this point in hindsight, but alas, it continued to limp on for a couple of years yet. That said, it wasn't like it ever got as bad as our next subject, as despite being one of the biggest stars of Golden Era WWF, when Jake the Snake Roberts moved over to WCW in 1992, things just didn't go as well for him there as they should have. Yes, after his exit from WWF the year prior, Jake signed on the dotted line with the Atlanta-based promotion, and there set about having a short run there. And while he may have had a memorable feud with Sting here, many fans have since proclaimed their infamous coal miner's glove match at Halloween Havoc as one of the worst in wrestling history. And on top of this, Jake's well-documented addiction issues were certainly slowing him down at the time. But at least he was able to find some redemption following on from it, because after a subsequent return to WWF, another spell in the wilderness, and an eventual turning of his life around with the help of Diamond Dallas Page, Jake Roberts would finally be able to get clean and live a life free of drugs and alcohol for the most part. That's right, it's nice to see Jake get a happy ending, but what about another short run that took place in the WWF? Well, one of the best of all time took place during the peak of the Golden Era in 1985. Who are we talking about here? Why, Terry Funk. Yes, In between being the technical wizard of the National Wrestling Alliance and the middle-aged and crazy godfather of Extreme Championship Wrestling, the Funkster actually had a brief run under Vince McMahon's watch right at the height of the Golden Era. And while this wouldn't exactly see him rise to the heights of winning world titles, it would see him maintain a very prominent spot in the main event scene. But wait, we hear you say, when was Terry Funk a main eventer in the mid-80s? After all, wasn't that the period of WrestleMania 1, when Hulk Hogan was dominating things on top of the card against opponents such as Rowdy Roddy Piper and Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff? Well, yes, that is true, but given how much success WWF was having at the time, more than 2 opponents were going to be needed for the Hulkster over the course of that summer. And this was exactly why once the champ laid waste to each of these men, the next person in line was none other than the former NWA World's Champion himself. Sure, given how over Hogan was, there was little chance Terry was actually going to dethrone him during any of these bouts, but the very fact that he got to share the ring with the biggest star in the industry at the time showed just how much confidence Vince McMahon had in his abilities as a heel. And he certainly proved worthy of this confidence, as throughout his run there, whether it was building up to Hogan by branding the likes of Aldo Marino with an iron, or teaming up with his brother Jimmy Jack Funk to take on Tito Santana and the Junkyard Dog, the Indiana native almost always stole the show. Hell, even when he faced the Hulkster on the house show circuit, he at points threatened to overshadow him. That said, as we mentioned earlier, he'd never quite be able to beat him. And that was why, after deciding to cut his losses in early 1986, he'd leave New York behind and return to the likes of All Japan and WCW for a while, with him not being seen inside a WWF ring again until he returned as Chainsaw Charlie in 1997. And this wasn't the only WCW territory-era star that had a brief 80s run with Vince McMahon either, as it happened. No, our next subjects did the same too. And we use the plural here because, in their case, it was a tag team, one of the greatest of all time in fact, the Brainbusters. Now, most fans who are aware of Arn Anderson and Tully Blanchard's career will no doubt be familiar with their time as part of Jim Crockett Promotions, where they served as founding members of the Four Horsemen alongside Ole Anderson and Ric Flair. And when they weren't working with their stablemates as part of a foursome there, they were usually able to be found pairing up as a duo, where they became 2-time NWA World Tag Team Champions. But the Carolinas weren't the only place their skills were utilized during this decade, as, in 1988, following a pay dispute with Jim Crockett, they decided to jump ship over to WWF and there rebrand themselves as the Brainbusters. And this proved to be the best move they could make at the time because now with a fresh coat of paint, Arn and Tully were able to wow a whole new audience with their skills. Sure, it helped that they were being managed by the legendary Bobby the Brain Heenan, but even if they weren't, the chances are they would have gone straight to the top anyway. It didn't matter if it was the Rockers, Strikeforce, or Demolition, eventually everyone fell to them. And this ultimately led to the pair winning the WWF Tag Team titles for the first and only time in July of 1989. That said, by this point, with new management now in place in their former home, they were already feeling the pull to return down south. And so that's why, just a few months later, they'd be WCW bound. But even if it was only brief, it was such a successful run for the Brainbusters that it's still remembered to this day, just as every other one-year run we've talked about is still remembered because ultimately, no matter what anyone says, quality will always top quantity.